Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the incredible rise, the staggering power, and honestly, the deeply complicated legacy of a man whose name is practically synonymous with American finance, J.P. Morgan. We're going to see exactly how one individual managed to amass so much influence that he literally became the safety net for the entire United States economy.
Okay, let's just dive right in. $3 trillion. That is a 3 with 12 zeros. It's the estimated asset value of the modern banking titan, J.P. Morgan Chase, today. After 200 years of consolidation, we're talking about the biggest bank in the world by market capitalization. But this massive financial empire traces its formidable DNA back to just one deeply ambitious, deeply flawed man. So how exactly did he build the foundation for this $3 trillion behemoth?
Well, to understand all that, we've got to go back to the very beginning. Part 1. The man who owned America. John Pierpont Morgan's life was literally a study in intense contrasts right from the jump. He was born in 1837 into a wealthy banking family, but his childhood was definitely not idyllic. He was this frail, sickly kid plagued by seizures and rheumatic fever. It was so bad that at one point, his dad actually exiled him to the Azores, these tiny islands in the middle of the Atlantic, for nearly a year just to recover. Fast forward to his early career, and he was a hot-tempered risk-taker, famously gambling company funds on a massive shipment of Brazilian coffee in 1859. But the real turning point happens right here in 1861. He strikes out to found his own firm and marries his first love, Amelia Sturgis. But then, tragically, just 4 months later, Amelia dies of tuberculosis. Left a widower at only 24 years old, an absolutely inconsolable Morgan threw himself entirely into his work. He never truly recovered from that loss, and it fueled a relentless, almost obsessive ambition.
And you know, that ambition quickly showed a really ruthless, opportunistic side. During the American Civil War, instead of fighting, Morgan just paid $300 for a substitute to take his place in the draft. But he didn't just avoid the war, he heavily profited from it. He financed the purchase of 5,000 surplus rifles from the government for $3.50 each. The catch? These were actually considered defective and too old to use. But after some really minor adjustments, his consortium turned right around and sold those exact same rifles back to the government for $22 each. That's an over 600% profit. This brazen war profiteering made him wildly unpopular with the public for obvious reasons, but it was really just a glimpse of the aggressive tactics to come.
That ruthless opportunism didn't just stay a phase. It evolved into a highly structured business strategy. Part 2. The Era of Morganization.
Now, what's really fascinating here is this concept of Morganization. The public literally coined this term to describe his specific, aggressive playbook. While other magnates dominated single industries, like Carnegie and steel or Rockefeller and oil, Morgan looked at the fiercely competitive, completely chaotic railroad markets of the time and saw a desperate need for consolidation. Instead of competing and slashing prices, Morganization meant taking over underfinanced railroad companies, ruthlessly streamlining their management, and merging them together into massive monopolies. By eliminating the competition entirely, he could dictate the prices. Plus, he demanded absolute board control before he'd rescue a struggling company, making sure he was always the one pulling the strings.
To really grasp the sheer scale of the strategy, consider this. Through Morganization, J.P. Morgan eventually owned a third of all railroad lines in the United States. To put that into perspective, remember that at this time, railroad companies made up 60% of America's entire stock market capitalization. That is massive. Money poured in from Europe because Morgan made the volatile railroad industry look incredibly stable and unified. He wasn't just a financier anymore. He was a titan architecting monopolies.
But here's the twist. Behind all this massive corporate control was a guy crippled by intense personal insecurities. Morgan was a towering, super intimidating figure with an incredibly aggressive way of speaking, but he suffered from a severe skin condition called rosacea, along with rhinophema, which left his nose deformed, enlarged, and deeply red. He was violently self-conscious about it. To the point where he'd actually order portrait artists to edit his nose to look normal. But in the boardroom, his startling appearance and commanding, aggressive demeanor absolutely terrified corporate boards into submission. He basically ruled through a potent mix of financial genius and pure physical intimidation.
Having essentially conquered the railroads, Morgan's ambitions naturally expanded outward. Part 3. Forging billion-dollar monopolies.
$480 million. That staggering sum represents what would become the largest business deal in history up to that point in 1901. Andrew Carnegie was getting ready to retire from his massive steel empire. So Morgan essentially told Carnegie, just name your price. Carnegie wrote down $480 million. Morgan accepted on the spot? No haggling, no hesitation. In fact, Morgan later confessed he gladly would have paid $100 million more. That is just an astonishing level of capital and conviction.
And what did he actually do with Carnegie Steel? He merged it with Federal Steel and a few others to create U.S. Steel. This became the world's very first billion-dollar corporation, boasting a market cap of $1.4 billion. This singular move gave Morgan control over roughly 2/3 of all American steel production. And just to put that $1.4 billion valuation in perspective, the entire manufacturing sector of the United States combined was capitalized at just $9 billion. So, by dominating both railroads and steel, he practically controlled the fundamental building blocks of the modern American economy.
But what happens when the very nation that fears your monopolistic power suddenly runs out of money? We arrive at this great paradox, where the United States government had to rely on the monopolists they feared to save their economy. Part 4. Bailing out the nation.
This perfectly captures the terrifying reality of the 1893 Depression. The U.S. was plunged into absolute chaos. The dollar was tied directly to the gold standard, and foreign investors, totally spooked by the economic collapse, started cashing in their bonds for physical gold. The U.S. government traditionally kept a minimum of $100 million in gold reserves to back the dollar. But by 1895, those reserves had plummeted to a catastrophic $9 million. The government was literally on the brink of defaulting on its loans, and with no central bank to step in, President Grover Cleveland was completely out of options.
So, enter J.P. Morgan. He travels down to Washington with this audacious, rapid-fire plan to bail out the federal government. Step 1. Form a private syndicate of elite global bankers. Step 2. Use 3.5 million ounces of gold to purchase $65 million worth of 30-year U.S. bonds. Utilizing a really obscure loophole from an old Civil War statute, Cleveland bypassed Congress completely and signed the deal right on the spot. Step 3 is the most incredible part. Morgan wired his men in New York and they bought out all the gold bonds in exactly 22 minutes. Literally 22 minutes. This decisive action instantly restored faith in the economy. The crisis was averted, and of course, Morgan secured very generous rates, handsomely lining his own pockets in the process. Fast forward a bit to 1907, and the country faces another massive panic. Bank runs are threatening to cause a full-blown depression. Once again, the government, this time under President Theodore Roosevelt, who, by the way, famously despised Morgan's monopolies, had to go hat in hand and ask Morgan for help. The events of 1907 paint this vivid, almost cinematic picture. Morgan is now 70 years old, and he's suffering from a really terrible, heavy cold. He summons dozens of the nation's top financiers to his private library on Madison Avenue. He tells them they need to pool their money to save their smaller, failing competitors to stop the panic. When they start dragging their feet, Morgan literally locks the heavy library doors. He refuses to let the wealthiest men in America leave until they agree to his bailout plan. By morning, they completely submit. The Treasury throws in $25 million, and disaster is averted by a sick, elderly man locking bankers in a room. You can't make this stuff up.
While he was briefly hailed as a hero for these dual bailouts, a chilling realization quickly washed over the American public. The nation was entirely too dependent on the wealth and whims of just one man. Part 5. The end of an era.
This extreme concentration of wealth and power simply couldn't last. The public grew deeply wary of this money trust operating unchecked on Wall Street. This led to intense government scrutiny, eventually culminating in Morgan being summoned to testify before the Peugeot Committee. Though Morgan strongly defended his actions, the hearings made it abundantly clear to lawmakers that relying on a handful of ultra-rich individuals to fix the economy was a massive vulnerability. This direct scrutiny paved the way for the establishment of the modern Federal Reserve, America's actual central bank. The age of the unchecked robber baron was ending. Morgan's mental and physical health deteriorated heavily under the stress of all that public backlash, and he died shortly after in 1913.
So, what does this all mean for us? How should we actually remember him? Was J.P. Morgan a patriotic savior who stepped in to stabilize a volatile America when literally no one else could? Or was he the ultimate robber baron, a guy who consolidated industries purely for his own profit and wielded a level of power that no private citizen should ever possess? It's a fascinating paradox. Because without him, the massive $3 trillion financial systems and consolidated industries we rely on today might look vastly different. Something to think about the next time you look at the towering banks that shape our modern world. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and we'll see you next time.